Yeah, so I want to talk about the three sort of pillars that, I mean, there are more, but I had to, I have only 20 minutes, so I had to choose three. And I'm going to talk about three things that happen when I work with data. And it's what happens when you get the raw data from somewhere, how do you work a bit with them, and what are the trade-offs you have to make, or how do you deal with the trade-offs that other people made and you using those data. The second one happens when data become visualizations, and again I will be only talking from my perspective and the projects that I was doing or I was a part of. And the third one would be about stakeholders and policymakers, and how do you, because projects that I do, they usually address, or it's some government or international institutions that are paying for this data project. So what do they want, or where do they, what kind of data they want, what kind of visuals they want, what kind of outcome they want. This is, I think it might be a very different field from if you work with the business companies or, I don't know, non-profit sector. Let's see, so the three pillars, and I'll start with what happens when we work with the concepts and indicators and data. The simple example, when we go and we want to just take one variable and make some visualizations. I'm a huge fan of maps. I was doing this 30 days map challenge back in November on Twitter, and that was one of the things when it's a very reputable data source that is supported by large foundations, and it was a blue day. I wanted to it was a blue day for 30 days map challenge. I wanted to make a map about water. So that's what I did. I went on the A data, I chose South Sudan, and I wanted to work with the distance to water. So then there is also a description of the data, which is very, very important, right? To see what's exactly in there that says that it measures access to shores, to lakes, to rivers, etc. So I create my map, and then I see that it looks very weird because it's like half of South Sudan is basically desert. And then I Google for actual map of what happens in South Sudan. You see that there are way more rivers, and that was like very surprising to me. So then I repeated this exercise with other countries, and it was the same. So basically, actually what the data were measuring was just the access to shores, so the distance to the lakes and the seas and the oceans, or the big rivers. So basically, it was a false information that took me, investigated this concept for 2 or 3 hours. Another one, very recent, I'm sure we all played with this thing, right? When we go deeper online and we see where the different fish creatures live. It's a very fascinating app, but then the question was what exactly it measures. Like when the fish said that it swims around 500 meters below the sea level, is it your normal area of habitat? Is it the deepest it can go, or what is it there? There was no information on the website, so I had to go on Twitter of the creator and then found somewhere in the tweets that's what he was saying. A bit more on what I do, and it comes so when we don't use just one variable, but we have to aggregate our several variables into some singular and very complex concept. And that's what I usually do when I go on dates, for example. And people ask me what I do, men ask me what I do, and then I say, how would you describe a chair? And then, they get scared, but then they basically say, what is a chair, right? It has like legs, it has this and this, it's made of wood. And then I say, okay, then how do you describe democracy? How do you describe culture? And then they kind of start getting what exactly I'm doing and being paid for. So how we describe culture, a question that's basically there is no single definition, right? And then this map would tell you that in every country, it's a real survey that was conducted 5 years ago, basically says that in every country, the perception of culture is different. So how do you work with policymakers that, let's say, all the part of UNESCO or the Council of Europe, the project that I was part of, how do you satisfy these different demands of what is culture into a single project that measures cultures around those member states? This is another example of what goes into how do we measure culture. It's one of the subcomponents that would say what is the cultural participation and what, for example, is democratic participation. And then there are multiple variables that go into the box, the concept, which might also satisfy or not satisfy whoever you are making this project for. The third problem is that, not the problem, but it's when you work with data, you quite often have to play a detective, right? Because at least in my field where I work, there is basically often no data for what is needed. And there is one of the examples of another project that I was a part of, when you strongly have to use the proxies for data, because you just don't have what the project requires or what you would love to have. And it's an example with the civil society, because I also work a lot with the nonprofits and civil society, and basically that variable was aiming to compare development of civil society in different countries. There is no ranking, there is no database that measures how many nonprofits exist in the world. So basically what we had to do is use the proxy from a database that was measuring the number of international nonprofit organization members in a given country. So it's not even NGOs that solve, but it's the best you can have. And this is it's either nothing or you have to be creative. But of course, it's explained very nicely that you have been creative. Now we go to the second part about what happens when the data visualizations appear, when the data become data visualizations. And I must make a confession that for most of the data visualizations that I see, I totally love them and I like creating them. I barely ever use them myself. And I put case of Eurostat because I was one of the user testers for a new fancy Dataviz website for Eurostat with lots of graphs and lots of interactive tools where you can click, you can see what's going on in there. And then they were asking me how would I access data, and I kept telling them I would just download the data. Like I don't need your fancy graphs, I don't need your fancy lines, this is really not what I'm working for. And to them it was a bit surprising because they were very sure that it's very nice and cool. And it is very nice and cool, it's just not useful for me. And so I think it's important to always keep it in mind when you produce a beautiful data visualization, that there will be people who won't need it, not because they don't like it. It might be the most beautiful thing on the planet, but it's just, not working. However, indeed, there are some data visualizations that I totally like and do play with, and there are just a few examples. One from the Harvard University that measures trade between the countries, and the second one is the food preferences over the world food preferences over the last 50 years. And none of the projects are mine, but I just really like them. And here is something that we've been a part of, and I'm saying we because two of my former colleagues are also here, and Jessica and CJ in front. And none of us is a designer, so I would really ask for professional designers to not, scream and say that we're really, really not doing great work. Plus, we had zero budget for it, but it's a very interesting case study, so bear with me. And you can see that there is an interactive tool that you can see if you go on that link. And then one thing I wanted to point out is that you see the scatter plot, but you would never see the labels. Which is like, why wouldn't you put the labels? That would be the first thing. If you want to play with the data, you would want to use it. But basically, the Council of Europe that we did this project for said no labels. Country members, they get very upset when they're here and not up there. So the only way for us to release it was to never mention, we could mention the country that was highlighted. So for example, Finland is the red dot in there, but other countries, there is no way you can individually click and figure it out, but basically that's the only way. And then when we work with ranking, sorry, I thought that they the screen might be bigger, but I'm kind of, you know. Okay, there is no need to really deeply look at what is written in there. It's just kind of a pattern. Very often when we present data, we go to some scorings or rankings, and we rank the countries and we give them some scores. And these three examples basically show three projects, and one is the Legato Prosperity Index, very famous index. The second one is a Good Country Index, it shows the ranking of countries. And the third one is, I think it's creativity, not creativity, maybe creativity index. Again, shows the scores for each country. The problem is when you aggregate the data, you use some statistical data, right? You apply some statistical procedures, and statistics is not about the points, it's about estimation of the points. So when you create a score that ranks countries like in the very first, very left ones, so countries basically, they have scores between, let's say, 86.5 and 86.4, and you would say that the second country is lower than the first one. That won't be the case, because statistically speaking, there is always a confidence interval, there is always some uncertainty, which was done for another project that we actually did, and we put this uncertainty table that basically, could you see what it tells? Okay, so the lines say like where the actual score could be. So it's not the dot, but the lines around. And basically, you could see that the countries at the very bottom, their lines do not overlap with the countries on the very top. So those countries are very, very different, definitely different, with all the possible statistical estimate. If you take half of the countries on top, half of the countries at the bottom, because those lines overlap, it means that they could be the same. So there is really no way to say that, and when we create data visualization, we force this rankings and country scores, we give a false impression to our audiences that one country, company, or whatever is performing better than it actually is. And the third one, about the data communication. So this was actually the line on top. I used to talk to the bunch of ministers of culture that they fully agree that math is not sexy, it's very hard to communicate. And it's very hard for policymakers to understand what happens when you work with data. So you create some rankings, then they ask, then they hear the word of factors, clusters, Bayesian analysis, some neural networks, and they say, oh, it's a black box, I don't trust it. And then it comes the political conversation of how do you know why my neighboring country that is exactly like mine is actually performing way better than myself, because you use this black box that no one knows what's in there. So what do you do with that? I possibly have two answers. One is about the PISA study, because PISA study, everybody likes it, everybody trusts it. Not many people know that PISA study is using the very hardcore Bayesian analysis to calculate their data, but because they've been doing it for so long and they're backed up by the OECD, I think they have this trust component that nobody really, there is not much of a conversation if we can trust what PISA scores are saying. The second one would be corruption perception index that is not advanced mathematically, let's put it this way, but to me, it's important to say that corruption perception index that appeared in 1995, it basically gained its popularity or trustworthiness sometime in the end of 2000s. So it's been more than 10 years when they kept producing it before it gained credibility. So everything we do with data, and we want some impact and output and outcome, and we see that it's not in there, maybe because it does need a lot of time. I'll go back to the project that we were doing again to show you how we dealt with the communication with the policymakers and how we changed our data visualizations based on what they were telling us. So we wanted our tool to be aimed at many different stakeholders. Of course, and so then we created this web interface where we wanted to show countries' performance and basically help countries a little bit to understand which areas they could perform. First, we just coded it in R and basically went to the ministries of culture around Europe to talk to the people in the ministries and say, do you understand what it means? Do you understand? Can you work with it? Do you think it is helpful? What can we do to make it even more helpful? So I'll show you the very first version that we used. And it was a Shiny app, very simple one. And that was basically showing the country performance on various components. And after communication with the policymakers, with the ministry people, so basically they told us, just this is not enough. We get to have definitions, we get to have way more text explaining what's in there. We cannot just see that there is a line, and we need way more explanation of what exactly you're trying to tell us. So just numbers, so the level of data literacy, data familiarity, understanding of what data tell you, in my experience was very low. But the willingness to learn was high, so we put a bunch of text sentences and a bunch of sentences to explain what is happening in there. Then it was another thing that we were trying to do. Basically, we wanted to say, okay, so if your country is not performing very well in a certain component, in a certain area of culture, what can you do? Do you, should you invest more in it? Should you not invest more in this? Is there any relevance to your country in particular? So we created this tool that we called an opportunity table. And we were presenting it. That was the first version, and the policymakers told us that it's difficult. They don't understand what's in there. They don't understand. They find it interesting when you see it and walk them through, but they would never be able to use it on their own. So we had to redesign it again by using way more text, changing the labels from simple one word into a bit of a longer word, and then again explaining what it is in there. And yeah. And then, so this project for indicator framework on culture and democracy that I was telling you about, it's not over, so there will be a third iteration with the data visualization and data updates. And but just to give you a bit of a snapshot of what policymakers, the politicians, they wanted from us in there, was that they wanted even more these things to touch and play with because they do like it. I don't know to what extent they really use it, but they really get excited when something bounces and but then they do want it to be put in the context, because to them to see how their country is performing against other countries is good, but it's attractive for maybe a minute. Then they want to see, okay, how it is relevant to me. So now what do I have to do? If you say I need to increase my participation of my people, the people of my country, in a cultural events, what do? Do I increase the number of opera theaters in my country, or do I decrease prices for the existing opera theaters? And for that one, of course, you need more country knowledge that our project isn't even aimed at, but because they're asking, so we want to introduce the component where we'll have to explain what exactly we'll be doing. And yeah, so more quants and quals. And again, way more explanation for the policymakers, how to make those data actionable for them, because there is the gigantic gap between excitement of seeing some numbers and actually understanding how they could use it in their daily professional life.